Hey everybody. So I am here in Connecticut. I'm sitting in my mom's luxurious study, and I started to think about trust today and how grief or layoffs create friction for trust. And I wanted to share with you some of my personal experiences about assumptions that I've made when leading in chaos, and hopefully I can share those with you, and some of those assumptions you will not make the same ones. Because, grief creates friction. And I think that's something to think about. Like, when you think about grief, we think about sadness, we think about loss, we think about longing. We often don't think about productivity or engagement or how to talk to someone about grief at work. And so that creates friction. But the other way that grief creates friction is that it's very isolating and we all kind of grieve our own way. And so that's one way. And another way that grief creates friction is that you end up kind of isolating and thinking about things more specifically, almost like going into a micromanaging mindset where it's either micromanaging or macromanaging. You go into micromanaging, like, what are they doing? How are they doing it? They're not doing it well. Or you go into the whole kind of like, I really don't give a crap. So I wanted to share with you my experiences of how to build trust by just simply not making some assumptions. So I think the first thing that happened to me one time was really understanding that the employee knows what they're doing. And this particularly happened to me when I was working for an organization. There wasn't actually death involved, but there was a chaos that was happening on the team. And I didn't really make a conscious decision, but I wondered if one of these employees knew what they were doing. And they were fully capable and knew very well what they were doing. The reason that I started to wonder about that was because they started to make errors and not connecting. I didn't connect at the time those errors with the chaotic thing that was happening on the team. So that's the assumption number one, that you want to assume, you want to actually go towards it. You want to assume that, remember that your employees knows their job and they're really good at it. And even if it's a new employee who's been with the company for 3 or 4 months, they know a little bit about what they're doing and they're getting better at it. So when you're dealing with chaos, instead of assuming that they don't know what they're doing or the mistakes that they're making are because they don't know what they're doing, assume that they do know what they're doing. Okay, the second one is often the hardest, and that is assume good intent. Now, when you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off, most of us assume negative intent, right? We think they did it to us personally, they're jerks, they're assholes, whatever, right? So instead, when you have an employee who is struggling with something or is maybe showing up to work late after layoffs have happened or after there's been a death of an employee, assume good intent. So assume that they tried to get to work on time. Assume that they're trying to be patient. Assume good intent. And that simple assumption will allow you to give them a little bit of grace. Now, grace is one of those words that a lot of people struggle with because it feels like if I give you grace, that means I'm letting you get away with something that I think that I know you did, right? So, but here's the thing, when you assume good intent, you're not letting them get away with anything. But what it does do is it allows you to take a moment to ask them questions to figure out whether or not it was good intent. So if you have an employee who, let's say there's a layoff and you just notice that employee is coming in later and later and later and later, instead of assuming that they want to quit their job, that they're no longer engaged, that that they're trying to pull one over on you, instead assume good intent and ask questions. Hey, I noticed that you're coming in later. What's happening? I noticed that you're not hitting your benchmarks. What's happening? Right? So you're assuming good intent. So that's the second one. The third one is kind of a blanket one, and that is don't assume anything else. You know that saying, assume makes an ass out of you, M.E. And it really does. When we assume things, we are making up stories from our own point of view that are usually incredibly inaccurate, right? I remember, during COVID, during the George Floyd, I assumed that people would come to me and ask me questions about what the organization should do. I was in HR. And I was the highest paid, African-American person on the team in the company. And I just assumed that people would come to talk to me. And I made up stories. I made up a ton of stories about why they didn't come and ask me my opinion about certain things. And those stories led to me being very, let's just say, lackadaisical about my job at that time because I did not verify any of those stories. I didn't ask. I made up stories. And so, yeah, it wasn't a good situation. So I think the hard thing about assumptions is we make them without thinking about them. But the next time that you say, well, I assume that she doesn't care about the work, or they're not meeting their benchmark, so I assume that that something else is going on in their lives, or they're not happy here, or whatever it is, ask yourself how you know that. And if the only piece of information you have about that is because of their current performance, then that means you're making an assumption that you maybe don't want to be making. Maybe you want to ask some questions instead. And then the last thing I want to say about, trust, we're kind of relieving the friction. Remember, it's a two-way street. And, we've seen it, you've seen it yourself, I'm sure, as a leader. When you make assumptions, when you don't trust someone, they in turn end up not trusting you, right? Because your behavior leads them to think that you don't trust them. And then let's say they are doing the work that you have asked them to do and they're doing it in a timely manner or to the best of their ability, then they start to not trust you. And that, as we know, is how teams fall apart. So that's it. Those are the things to think about. Grief creates friction. Layoffs create friction. But if you can go in and not assume or make some very good assumptions about intent and about that they know what they're doing in their job, you can actually decrease the friction and your team can get back up to running as efficiently as they were before this kind of chaos. All right, y'all, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're on LinkedIn, don't forget to hit a like button and please share it. And thanks so much for stopping by. And please remember, you matter. All right, make it a great day. Bye.